David Wilkins of the Harvard Law School. He's also director of the Harvard program on the legal profession. And his paper, I'm sure, has the prize-winning title of all the papers submitted. If you can't join them, beat them. Why black law firms in the 1990s could not duplicate the success of law firms in the 1960s. Professor Wilkins.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here on many dimensions. Actually, Steve Flanders actually stole a little bit of my line when Steve defined himself as the ultimate outsider. I do think you have me on two categories, that he says he's not Jewish and he's not a lawyer. I only have one of those. I'll actually get a chance to say more of the fascinating experience that it's been for me to sit here in this conference over the last few days when I get to talk tomorrow, for those of you who are still around. But for now, I want to pick up on my former student Ellie Wall's challenge and talk a little bit about what the experience of black lawyers has to say, what the experience of Jewish lawyers has to say about the experience of black lawyers. But the first thing I have to say is, isn't he great? I'm so proud of him. That was a terrific, and it's a terrific paper on an important area that really, I've been saying for years, has needed to be written about. Look, we've heard a lot about blacks as a subtext here. We've heard a lot about the important role that Jews played in the civil rights movement. We've heard a lot about the relationship between discrimination and opportunity and modes of identity. We've even heard about the transmogrification of stereotypes and the placing of one group for another. I want to talk about all those things, but from the perspective now not so much of the Jewish lawyers, but of the black lawyers. It turns out that all of these features of overlap between the experiences of blacks and Jews have had an important role to play in the area that I've spent a lot of time studying, which is the development of something called a black corporate law bar in the 50 years since Brown versus Board of Education. The role here of Jewish lawyers in the development of the black corporate bar, I think, has been a quite interesting one. I want to take this up particularly in the role, in the experience of black lawyers trying to replicate the experience of Jewish law firms. But first, I think it's important to get some history out on the table. That is, when John W. Davis, who's already been mentioned here before, got up to defend the school board in Brown versus Board of Education, pro bono, mind you, in 1954, he was not, I think, worried about black lawyers coming into his law firm. I don't think actually that was something that ever crossed his mind. In fact, of course, the issue on the table in terms of protecting the integrity of the corporate bar, has already been said here, had to do with the growth of Jewish and other immigrant lawyers in the bar. In fact, some of the leading figures of the bar, like Boston, who actually had quite horrific views when it came to immigrants. Boston was on the advisory committee of the NAACP. Paul Cravath, where there was not a Jewish lawyer, or certainly not a Jewish partner in Cravath until I think the 1960s, Cravath's family started Fisk College. And Cravath himself was very involved in Fisk College. Cravath's brother, actually uncle, started the Fisk Jubilee Singers. One of the very interesting things I've uncovered in the research on this book. Nevertheless, by 1954, there were actually black lawyers who had spent some time in corporate practice. Turns out the great Paul Robeson, the singer and artist, had graduated from Columbia Law School and briefly, very briefly, spent some time in an unnamed Wall Street law firm where he sat in the back room and eventually quit when the stenographer said that she would not take dictation from a nigger. At least according to Robeson's autobiography. In 1947, Barbara Scott Preskel was hired by the law firm which eventually became known as Paletti, Friedkin, Praschker, Feldman, and Gartner. She was a graduate of Yale Law School, and she became, as far as I can tell, after Robeson, the first black associate to work at any New York firm of any size. But the most important person was actually William Coleman, who actually signed the brief at Brown versus Board of Education, who was an associate hired in 1949 at Paul Weiss Rifkin, a law firm that actually is very self-consciously not a Jewish law firm in its formation, though was formed by a Jewish lawyer and a mainstream WASP lawyer who were classmates at Columbia Law School, best friends, and who could not get a job together anywhere, and who therefore decided to start their own law firm and were shortly joined by the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, and dedicated themselves to starting a law firm that was open to everyone. Having said that, even Paul Weiss required a little nudge from Felix Frankfurter to hire Bill Coleman. Bill Coleman only graduated #1 in his class from Harvard Law School and had clerked on the United States Supreme Court and editor at the Harvard Law Review. But in keeping with, I think, something that was said at the first panel, could not get a job in Philadelphia. No law firm in Philadelphia would even interview him, which actually was the same experience that John McCoy of the famous New York lawyer who could not also get a job in Philadelphia, which is why he eventually went to New York. But Felix Frankfurter called people at Paul Weiss and said, I really think you should hire this person. And as Coleman later on said, I think they would have been embarrassed not to hire me at Paul Weiss, given my credentials. And he went to Paul Weiss and actually for several years had a very successful firm, career there. It's not surprising that the first firms to hire black lawyers were predominantly the Jewish firms, not the Wall Street law firms, but rather the Jewish law firms that tended to be on Park Avenue. So Judge Robert Carter, who was the right-hand man to Thurgood Marshall in the whole lead up to Brown, when he left the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in a tiff, actually, in an interesting moment that I will come back to in a second, because Thurgood Marshall had picked a Jewish lawyer to be his successor and not Robert Carter, much to his chagrin, went to become a partner at a law firm, at the Paletti law firm that had hired Barbara Scott Preskill in the 1940s. In fact, he wasn't the first black partner in a law firm. That Carter came in 1968. In 1961, Sam Pierce, who had been the Assistant Secretary to Labor under Eisenhower, was hired at Battle, Fowler, Stokes, and Keel, a law firm that was again on Park Avenue, and one of whose senior partners was Ted Keel, who was a Jewish kid from Brooklyn who had worked his way up to Cornell College and Cornell Law School, eventually becoming a major figure in the Roosevelt administration in labor matters, and had come to become a leading labor lawyer in New York and eventually a partner in this firm. Keel brought in Sam Pierce as, from what I can figure out, is the first black partner at any substantial New York law firm. Pierce went on to a very distinguished career in both private practice and public service, and eventually, significantly, had his name added to Battle Fowler, which eventually became Battle Fowler, Stokes, Keel, and Pierce. But then he went off to work in the Reagan administration, and life worked out less well from there. And if anybody doesn't know the story, I'd be happy to tell it later on. It's a very sad one.